Yeah, because
Um,
when you look at numbers and stuff like that, or there's always an argument for and against that. Because I was in TV before I came to the center, and
okay.
live versus like a look live,
Hmm.
and the replay numbers are really good actually.
Nice. Yeah, I'm thinking if like, I don't know, I'd love to be able to give you like you and Lexi and whoever this new web producer is,
Uh-huh.
something like, like I can edit the Zoom recording so that it's not me like filling space for 10
Yeah,
minutes and
exactly.
then
There's post production is important.
exactly.
You
I
know,
would hate for you. I hate that you guys have to do that anyway. So it'd be nice if I could like clean that up a little for you.
and there's some actually pretty good programs that aren't complicated for editing.
Nice.
Okay, you're the host.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. Good luck today.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Constitution Center. So excited to have you here with us today. We are very excited to welcome Dr. Allison Dorsey from Swarthmore University to talk to us a little bit about the Reconstruction amendments. Very excited to dive into those 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments with everyone. Do me a favor while we wait for our scholar to join us. If you wouldn't mind testing out that chat box for me, let me know where you're tuning in from, who you are tuning in with, and if you have any questions for Dr. Dorsey, feel free to pop those into the chat. We are very excited to get started in just a couple of minutes. All right, folks, welcome to the National Constitution Center. Excited to see some familiar faces, some familiar names rather, pop into our participant list. We are so excited to have Dr. Dorsey here joining us today. And we're going to take a look at the Reconstruction Amendment. So very excited that we're able to invite her to be with us today. Dr. Dorsey is live at the National Constitution Center, and my friends over there are getting set up. So let me make sure that everybody can get into the Zoom, including Dr. Dorsey and our folks who are live at the National Constitution Center. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're very excited to see you all today. We are super excited to be celebrating Independence Week with a series of wonderful programs featuring brilliant scholars who are here at the National Constitution Center to share their research, their insights into the principles of the American Revolution and where we see those throughout the US, throughout our history. So it's going to be a lot of fun. We have our friends who are live at the Constitution Center who will be joining in person to see Dr. Dorsey's talk. And then, of course, all of you who are here to watch virtually. Our friends at the NCC are getting set up. But feel free, if you'd like, pop in the chat where you're tuning in from, who you are tuning in with, and what, if any, questions you have for Dr. Dorsey.
I'm ready when you are.
Awesome.
Okay.
All right. We've got about 2 minutes until go time, folks, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm also going to pop into the chat, friends, for those of us who are tuning in virtually here. We have a number of programs happening throughout the weekend. We call it Finding the Founders. We have a number of scholars who are joining us virtually and on site at the National Constitution Center to talk about their research, their interests in the American Revolution, and how some of their research ties into these kind of broader principles of the American Revolution, of the Constitution, of American democracy. So feel free to check those out. We have some really good ones taking place on Sunday, July 2nd. We have Dr. Stuart Lieberger of LaSalle University, who's going to talk about the real Independence Day, if you will, in declaring independence. A little factoid that you can share with your friends is that July 2nd was technically supposed to be the real Independence Day, at least according to many of the founders, especially John Adams, who wrote a letter about it. But he'll be joining us, as well as Bruce Murphy from Lafayette College, who's going to talk about the Roberts Court. And understanding the Roberts Court. So feel free to check out that link that I just popped into the chat. I'll pop it in again. A very timely discussion to be talking about the Roberts Court. I'm sure we're all watching those SCOTUS decisions roll down today, and so it'll be kind of great to unpack a little bit of what's been going on. So feel free to tune in on Sunday if you're interested. And then also on July 4th, very exciting if you want to spend Independence Day with us. We have the amazing Dr. Tanya Tames-Taylor from Westchester University, and she is going to join us for a discussion about Frederick Douglass, specifically what shaped him and kind of what shaped his perspectives, his views, his life, his views on the Constitution. And in between, or kind of incorporated into that discussion, we have one of our actors at the National Constitution Center who is going to read an excerpt of Frederick Douglass's incredible speech, a portion of it, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. So a great kind of look at understanding this idea of freedom and equality for all, and who was excluded in that original version of We the People and in the American Revolution. We've got a couple minutes until go time. I'm communicating at base camp with my friends who are live at the NCC. We are really excited to have Dr. Dorsey here, and it looks like we're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. All right, folks, just another minute, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. Feel free to pop into the chat where you're tuning in from. We always like to see where everyone's joining us from. And a very happy Independence Week to you all as well. Hello from Phoenix. Very excited to have you here, Dawn. Awesome. We've got the Southwest represented well. I see some folks from Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Welcome. We're so excited that you're here. In about 1 minute, we're going to have Dr. Dorsey take the stage and talk about Reconstruction amendments. If you have questions for Dr. Dorsey, we encourage that. Please pop them into the chat to me. I'm going to text my questions to my colleagues at the National Constitution Center, who will pass them along to Dr. Dorsey at the end of the talk. So please, as thoughts come to you, just type those in and we'll make sure that we get those to Dr. Dorsey. Hi, folks. For those of you just tuning in about 1 minute, we apologize for the delay. In about 1 minute, we're going to get started with Dr. Dorsey, but I will shamelessly plug some very fun events that are taking place at the National Constitution Center, both virtually and in person for those of you who are interested. We have a number of scholar talks taking place, like the one that we're about to see throughout the rest of the week, including one about declaring independence, the real Independence Day on July 2nd, and then another one about understanding the Roberts Court, which again, very timely given the time of year for SCOTUS decisions. And then on Tuesday, the 4th of July, we have Dr. Tanya Thames-Taylor, who's coming in to talk about Frederick Douglass. We also have an actor who is going to read excerpts from Frederick Douglass's speech, What to the Slave, is the 4th of July. That's going to be a wonderful program. So feel free to check out that link that I just popped into the chat box to register. And then also on July 4th, we have Bob Skiba from the William Way Center in Philadelphia, who's going to talk to us about LGBTQ history and how some of these First Amendment demonstrations and protests started in Philadelphia, right in front of Independence Hall, actually, which is right across the street from the National Constitution Center. Really learning about how Philly is kind of one of the starting points for these protests and these fights to secure freedom and equality for all. So he'll be joining us on July 4th as well, and he gives a remarkable presentation. So if you're interested and you'd like to learn a little bit more about any of the topics I just covered, feel free to check out that link, and you can register for those talks as well. And for those of you who are local or maybe planning trips to Philadelphia, we have a number of free admission days coming up at the center, which include a ton of fun activities, including these scholar talks that I mentioned, but also free museum days, free admission days on July 2nd, and also the 4th of July. So come check us out. We're right in the heart of Old City, Philadelphia, and it's a lot of fun. We've got Revolutionary War reenactors who are going to be set up outside of the museum in tents, and they've got all of their supplies that they need. We also have family fun activities. All of our exhibits are open. A lot of fun stuff.
On which?
And
Participants, is that an option?
And it looks like we're going to get started in just a minute or
11.
two.
Participants, yeah, 11.
All right, folks. About 1 more minute until we get started, and then we're going to begin. Thank you for your patience. If you're interested in learning more about Dr. Dorsey, we're going to go ahead and get started. Here we go.
In addition to our normal program, we like to bring in scholars to give us talks and different perspectives on different times throughout history, not just the founding period, but the full kind of look at the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and all of that. So American histories, and really happy to have wonderful scholars coming join us today. We have Dorsey, who is Professor Emeritus of History at Faulkner College, who is going to talk about the Reconstruction amendments. Spotty. Thanks so much. It says she's muted.
Reconstruction, as W.B. Boyce said in his important 1945 volume, Black Reconstruction,
We're sending.
is the history of the part which Black folks played in the attempt to reconstruct democracy in America. His
1935 book was largely ignored by the historians of the day, but in 1988, our current preeminent historian of Reconstruction, Eric Foner, offered this assessment of Reconstruction. This was one of the first books that I read in graduate school and put my feet on the path along with Du Bois to studying Reconstruction. His notation here that our society was attempting to live up to the noble professions of our creed is important. And then I ask you to hold that in your mind's eye as we go forward briefly in our conversation. I was discussing with folks earlier that I am of a slightly different generation than most of the undergraduates that I just stopped teaching a year ago. Part of that difference is that they were born digital and I was not. As a historian, my emphasis tends to focus on documents rather than images, but occasionally an image is helpful. I selected this image because it captures in a beautiful color drawing the idea of hundreds of thousands of Black people following behind the Union Army trying to get to freedom. This is capturing not the story of the 13th Amendment, but the story of the Emancipation Proclamation. And it's important that we remember that the Emancipation Proclamation does not end slavery in America. The Emancipation Proclamation is first and foremost a war measure, right? It is designed to destabilize the Confederacy, but more importantly, the Emancipation Proclamation is written, issued, and signed by Abraham Lincoln, who is President of the United States, for all intents and purposes of the Union, meaning that technically he doesn't have power and authority over the Confederacy. So people are being freed in those states in rebellion, as the Emancipation Proclamation says, as the Union Army reaches them. But it's very important for us to remember that there are states in the Union, as the Emancipation Proclamation is being read aloud, where people are still enslaved. So if you were an enslaved person in Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, or Missouri, you are still enslaved. The Emancipation Proclamation then only freeing those people in states of rebellion. What ends slavery in America is the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment, Section 1, specifically speaking to slavery and involuntary servitude, ends the process of chattel slavery in America. I'll just say that contrary to popular belief, the abuses of slavery that last 200 plus years, the greatest crime is not that you are not paid for your labor. Yes, of course, everyone would like to be paid for their labor. The greatest crime of American slavery is that it is hereditary, that it was based on race, and that it kept people from their ability to protect and care for their progeny and their families. Right? So the end of this horrible process requires an amendment to the Constitution. I'll say that for abolitionists in this period, particularly Frederick Douglass, an argument that we could hold to our creed, again, thinking about Eric Foner's words, and hold to slavery was a tension from the beginning, and that it had to be resolved, and it is resolved first here in the passage of the 13th Amendment, which is ratified December 6th, 1865. It is followed by the 14th Amendment, ratified July 9th, 1868. This is the amendment that Thurgood Marshall held up as one of the most important amendments to the US Constitution. It is certainly the amendment that changes how the Constitution protects all of us, in so much as it formally recognizes citizenship. It is necessary because of the Dred Scott decision, a wrongly decided decision of the US Supreme Court that argued that Black men had no rights that white men were bound to respect because they could not be citizens of the United States. So for anything else to go forward after the end of slavery, people of African descent, newly exiting slavery, needed the protections of citizenship. So this enshrines in the US Constitution birthright citizenship, which benefits not just African Americans, but everyone else who comes afterwards, right? I chose another image to speak to that, right? These are two post-Civil War soldiers. One Black, a reminder that African American men served as part of the United States colored troops, more than 200,000 during the war, involved in fighting the war against the Confederacy to free themselves and their progeny, and that many a Union soldier also returned from the war with the same circumstances: injured, disabled, missing limbs, right? A reminder that an entire generation of women, Black and white, lost brothers, fathers, potential marriage partners because of this war. But note the caption here: a man knows a man. As Douglas argued, to fully stand in my manhood requires acknowledgement of my citizenship in this nation. So the 14th Amendment has granted citizenship rights to African Americans. This was also necessary because though the Confederacy is defeated during Reconstruction, it's very clear that the former members of the former Confederacy were not gung-ho about the idea of African Americans being free or of them being citizens and participating in civil society. Congress had attempted to address this with the Civil Rights Act of 1866. But there is a question as to whether or not Congress can make rulings with regards to citizenship without citizenship being articulated in the US Constitution. So the 14th Amendment does that. It grants us a clear understanding of what our rights are. Perhaps nothing else in the Constitution is nearly as close, with the exception of the original Bill of Rights. In addition to birthright citizenship, it demands equal protection of the law. And it also argues that if Black citizens are being denied those rights, that Congress can in fact act to enforce those rights, right? So it empowers Congress to protect our rights as citizens. The last of the three Reconstruction amendments is the 15th Amendment, ratified February 3rd, 1870. As you can see from the text, it's a little subtle, perhaps more subtle than some of us are comfortable with. It says the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In the same way that the 14th Amendment had been specifically about trying to address issues of citizenship for African Americans, this piece of this amendment, the 15th Amendment, is designed to get at voting rights, recognizing barriers that were being erected across the country, barriers of race, color, and previous condition of servitude. But note that it doesn't actually give anyone the right to vote. It simply says we will not have these barriers to voting. Right? In theory, the United States addresses this again with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but that's a completely different and separate conversation. In this particular moment, this is the best that they do, right? They say there will not be barriers on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In theory, all men, the people who previously had been given the right to vote, would then be allowed to vote as of the 15th Amendment. Not so much. Native American populations are not necessarily enfranchised with the 15th Amendment. In some parts of the country, Hispanic populations are not enfranchised with the 15th Amendment, and certainly women are not enfranchised with the 15th Amendment. But it is important for us to think about, even though if we think of the process of changing the Constitution as a slowly evolving over and over toward a more perfect union. We don't start perfect, we're slowly moving there. Then this goes a long way. I'm most interested, because of what I research and what I study, in what African-American men did with that right to vote. One of the things that we know from documents is how many African-American men rushed to register to vote as soon as the 15th Amendment was passed, right? And what did they do with that right to vote? They voted themselves and their peers into office. And then once in office, how are they using their politics? They are using their power as political agents to aid their community. Across the South, for example, we see Black legislators create public systems of education across the South, state by state by state. Remember, before the American Civil War, most of the South did not have a public school system. People with resources educated their children, but argued that it was unfair to expect them to have to pay taxes to, quote, educate other people's children. Newly elected African Americans developed systems to pay taxes so there would be public education for everyone. I was stunned in my first work in Georgia to see how much Black elected officials pushed to challenge abuses of systems of jail and convict lease early in this process. So in 1870 and 1871, they are putting bills on the floor in Georgia saying that the abuse of prisoners in terms of renting them out and exploiting them for convict lease should not happen. The bill doesn't pass, but it's the language of the bill that's amazing, right? It says we are free, we are citizens, we should be punished when we have committed a crime, but not exploited such that it looks like slavery. What are they responding to? They're responding to that loophole embedded in the middle of the 13th Amendment, right? Except as punishment for crime thereof, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Right, that little loophole allows for 3 decades of the abuse of Black men and women and children in a system very close to slavery based on their alleged criminality, right? I will also say that they use their power to vote and their service as legislators across the South, not just big legislators, but everything from sheriff to dog catcher, they're running for office, to make the case for well-maintained public roads. That's not just road work being done by exploited Black labor. In addition to schools, they talk about hospitals, they talk about orphanages. What we are seeing is what we expect, I think, of American politicians, that they use their power and resources to aid their community. The end of Reconstruction, sadly, happens because of complicated rulings by the US Supreme Courts in terms of legislation, but also the withdrawal of federal troops from Southern soil in 1877. So if you think back to our original image of people following behind the Union Army to get to freedom, to leave their plantations and get to freedom because the army has come through, I want you to hold that image in your mind and then just lift those Union soldiers in those blue uniforms out of the photo. Imagine that they're gone. So now that you would have hundreds of thousands of Black people on the road trying to get to freedom, and what might they encounter in addition to cold and hunger and not having a place to sleep? They would encounter members of the former Confederacy who don't feel that they should have the right to move, the right to be free, the right to look for their families, the right to run for office, and they are met with extreme violence. Right? So the minute Southern troops are gone, and in some parts of the South, the upper South, where Reconstruction is resolved long before the Southern troops are gone in the Union troops are gone in 1877, there's been extreme violence designed to push African Americans back toward a system that looks like slavery. Right? So between extra legal violence, by individual white citizens, as well as organized white citizens, the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia, et cetera, there is political violence as white Southern men win their voting rights back. They begin to elect themselves into office, and they very quickly begin to pass as many laws as they possibly can to curtail the freedoms of African Americans who've just walked away from slavery in 1865. The cherry on the cake is Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the Supreme Court argues that those newly established rules of segregation and denial of inclusion are not just perfectly fine, but if there's any harm, it is only in the imagination of African Americans. Perhaps some of the most egregious gaslighting to come out of the Supreme Court before the 21st century. So the three amendments to Reconstruction are the 13th, which ends slavery, the 14th, which grants citizenship, specifically birthright citizenship, and equal protection under the law, as well as due process, and the 15th Amendment, which sees Black men enfranchised, not just in the South, but as well in the North. The backlash against Reconstruction will see, unfortunately, the development of Jim Crow, which will last from the turn of the 20th century through until the successes of the civil rights movement in the middle 1960s. So one step forward, two steps back. This is an endless struggle. I say again, we are always in a battle to achieve a more perfect union. I think these three amendments moved us very far along the way, but I'll end by saying that the fight continues.
Do we have any questions from the audience? There was one question online. It was more of a clarification. The 1835 book that was largely ignored, you mentioned earlier. Could you restate that title?
Sure. It's W.E.B. Du Bois's book, Black Reconstruction, toward a history of the part which Black folks played in the attempt to reconstruct democracy in America. It is a very thick book, full of lots of detail and wonderful Du Boisian prose. Unfortunately, at the time, most historians of this period were part of the Dunning School and rejected any analysis of race that was not rooted in white supremacy. And for decades, Du Bois's book is ignored. I believe the American Historical Review or the Journal of American History, I'm not sure which, eventually published a review of a book that stands this tall, and the review was 1 paragraph long.
We had one more question online. Oh, sorry. We'll take the question in the room first, then the online question. We'll get to, just so people watching at home, we're going to get to the question in a second.
Can you give us a little bit more information how the separate but equal process evolved?
So it's important to recognize that Americans have struggled with racial segregation long before the American Civil War. So if you look at the northern states, you'll find state after state, African Americans protest being denied the right to ride on the rail car, being denied the right to enter or rent a hotel room, being denied the right to be seen in a hospital, right? So the idea of segregation is not particularly Southern, it's American, in the same way that slavery was not just Southern, it was American, right? So after the Civil War, African Americans presumed, especially after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the 14th Amendment, that as citizens, they would have full and equitable rights. Meaning, if you and I both buy a ticket to ride the train, and you have a first class ticket, and I have a first class ticket, we're both going to sit in first class, right? That makes reasonable sense. What we find throughout the South and parts of the North is that is not an assumed given. So if we think about Ida B. Wells being thrown off the train, for example, she had bought a first class ticket. She sat in the first class car. She was told that she needed to move and sit in the colored car. She refused. She is physically thrown off the train that she is on. The person who takes the tickets enlisted the aid of 2 other white men, and they literally throw her off the train. She sues, she wins her case at the lower level. The railroad challenges, and it goes to a higher court, which then decides for the railroad, right? So that is the kind of problem that African Americans are encountering after the Civil War. In the case of separate but equal, as we know it from Plessy versus Ferguson, Plessy and his group of activists decide that they are going to challenge this. What the Supreme Court ultimately rules is it cannot be the case that in making African Americans citizens, that it was presumed that African Americans were now the equal of white men, right? That cannot be the case. And so they say separate is not a problem as long as it's separate but equal. Of course, you and I are old enough to know that that was not the case, but let's just hold on to that for a second. And ultimately, the Chief Justice says, if it is of the belief, if African Americans are of the belief that a separate facility is marking them as inferior, that is a function of their imaginations. That's their belief system. That's not reality. That's just the interpretation that they're spinning on it, right? So, right, I'll just say that the dissenting opinion in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, and what, again, I wasn't born digital, I'm a historian, I'm about documents, but also reading the documents is very insightful. And reading the dissenting opinions in Plessy versus Ferguson, the justice says, it's impossible for Black people not to understand that they are being deemed inferior when they're being made to be in a separate car. It's not their imagination at all. It is the point. Your point is to say, you cannot be with us. We will charge you for the first class ticket, but you can't ride in the first class car. And so that then says segregation can be the rule of law for most of the nation. Contemporarily, students think about water fountains. Water fountains are the least of those concerns, right? If you can't go in the public library, that's different than a water fountain. If you can't be taken into the nearest hospital because that hospital doesn't treat Black patients, that's a matter of life and death. The story that was sort of shocking for me and helped me really understand this when I was doing my work on Atlanta were that after the Civil War, the city of Atlanta segregated its cemeteries. So people who had been Black dead and white dead had been buried side by side. The city of Atlanta literally dug up Black bodies, informed African Americans that if they wanted their folks reinterred, they would have to pay for a separate headstone, or all of those bodies would be put in a mass grave. Right? That's a little bit different than a water fountain. It's American history.
So questions online are kind of all along the same theme, so I'm going to give them to you at the same time, all related to the end of Reconstruction. So Don is asking about the dispute in the 1876 election and kind of the different slates of electors and how that led, what effect that had on Reconstruction. And Sophia is asking Supreme Court's influence on the end of Reconstruction. And then Sally is asking if indeed all the gains of Reconstruction were ultimately reversed after 1877. I know that was a lot, sorry.
I'm gonna start with the end. So are all the gains reversed? No. So hereditary chattel slavery is over. Right? So because of that loophole in the 13th Amendment, and because of contemporary conversations, many youngsters have said, oh, Professor Dorsey, slavery never went away. And I was like, well, actually, no one came and took my children from me and told me that they were going to be sold for someone else's profit and that I would never see them again. So yes, American chattel slavery ends with the 13th Amendment. A new system develops, convict lease, right? Exploitation of prisoners. That is another form of violent, non-funded, compulsory labor, but it is not hereditary. It is not what had been before. And if there's any question, again, if you look at the literature, Black people are very clear that they're not slaves anymore, right? Things may not be as ideal as they would like, especially after Reconstruction, but they're very clear that they are not living the experience that their grandparents had lived. So no, not all of the gains are lost. The 14th Amendment doesn't cease to exist despite the slaughterhouse cases, despite Plessy versus Ferguson, despite the rising violence of the Ku Klux Klan. The 14th Amendment still exists. And as the NAACP, first the Niagara movement and then the NAACP will spend decades building a case to challenge racial segregation in all of its forms based on the 14th Amendment. So that's not lost, and it's an essential tool that gets us to the Civil Rights Act and to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The loss in access to voting is real, but it's not permanent. It is important to note, as each of the barriers is erected, the poll tax, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, etc., African Americans put time and energy in working to subvert those challenges, right? And reaching out to organize at the local level, at the state level, and reaching out to organize at the national level. If we think about the horrible racial violence that happens in Arkansas, in Florida, and Mississippi, and Louisiana, in Georgia, disproportionately, it intensifies around Black people actually using their voting rights and challenging white authority in elections, which is how American democracy is supposed to work. So I think we can see that loss and feel it, but it is, it's a spark, right? So it's a defeat, but it drives people to continue to stay engaged, right? To understand that you fight this fight, then you fight the next fight, then you fight the next fight, and you fight the next fight. So for all of those people who stayed in, no, not all of the gains are lost, but it is a setback. There's no way to think about the period that historians refer to as redemption as anything other than a tremendous setback. The Supreme Court is involved in so much as it issues the rulings in the slaughterhouse cases and in Plessy versus Ferguson, which undermine the spirit of the 14th Amendment.
One more question.
Where do you think we are today?
I was hoping nobody was going to ask me that question. After yesterday and this morning's rulings, I am reminded of the adage from civil rights elders who said, we are not weary, we are not defeated, we can recognize a setback for what it is, and that each setback is a call to regroup and to begin to fight again. I read Sherilyn Eifel's response to the affirmative action ruling last night, right before I went to bed. And as a historian, I share her sense that to have the court argue that the Constitution is colorblind when our Constitution before Reconstruction was clearly not colorblind, and after the addition of the 3 amendments during Reconstruction, it is decidedly not colorblind, right? The 13th Amendment is about ending slavery. Slavery is a racially marked hereditary system in the United States that disproportionately affected people of African descent and indigenous populations. So no, that's not colorblind. The 14th Amendment, in the language of the 14th Amendment, is decidedly not colorblind. Neither is the language of the 15th Amendment. So this willful misreading of the Reconstruction and of the Constitution in order to arrive at this ruling about affirmative action was, again, as Sherilyn Eiffel said, expected, but still shocking. It's such a tortured reading of the Constitution, and certainly disregards the importance and the true meaning of things like Brown versus Board of Education. So I recognize that we're in a low place to answer your question. We're in a low place right now. And I give all Americans who are committed to progressive change permission to take a beat. Take this 4th of July and reflect on what the Constitution means to you and what you think needs to be done to keep us on that path toward becoming a more perfect union. Regroup, have a barbecue with your family, and then, as of Wednesday morning, begin the process of strategizing about how we continue to move forward in a more progressive way. So that's the best I can do today.
Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions.
Okay,
We really
thank
appreciate it.
you.
All right. Thank you so much to everyone for tuning in. We are so grateful for your participation in today's talk with Dr. Dorsey. I agree, Sally. She is a phenomenal presenter, and we're excited to have her back again. And we hope you enjoyed this presentation. Again, please check out the other scholar talks that we have taking place throughout the weekend. I posted them in the chat here. But just to end with what Dr. Dorsey, just to kind of echo her endorsement there of, if you're dismayed or disheartened by anything that's, happened recently, or, anything that's kind of on your mind regarding the Constitution, American history, anything like that, a great way to kind of kick off our Independence Weekend is to, as she said, enjoy it, spend time with your family, have a barbecue, but then, get ready on Wednesday to continue the fight to form a more perfect union. Because as we know, democracy is not a destination, it is a journey. So we're going to continue, welcoming these wonderful scholars and hearing everything they have to say and kind of taking their inspiring words with us as we move about to form a more perfect union. With that, I want to thank you all so much for tuning in. We hope to see you back at another one of our programs coming up soon. And again, thank you for spending part of your Independence Week with us. I'll stick around if anybody has any more questions that I can answer, but otherwise wishing you all a wonderful, safe, and happy weekend. And we'll see you again soon. Take care, everyone. All right, everyone. It looks like we don't have any more questions. Well, we look forward to seeing you again soon, and we will see you next time at the National Constitution.